So when we talk about representations, is there a presumption that every generation experiences this the same way? I mean, I've been talking about sexual politics of meat for 25 years. Not only how have things changed, but how do 20-somethings experience this versus 30-somethings or 40-somethings? I think the sad thing is that the assumption that we should be eating meat begins before we even articulate. Whatever our parents feed us determines a palate for us. When I meet students on campuses in the second decade of the 21st century, am I talking to students who are conceptually approaching this issue different than 20 years ago? I find that a lot of the questions continue to be the same. They're asking me, don't we need meat for protein? There's some basic assumptions about meat eating that operate in our culture that we're pushing up against, but it pushes back. One thing that's changed over the years is that the variety of vegan food that's available has increased, and there's vegan food on campuses. I think a lot more people are finding that veganism is easy to embrace. And there's one study that kind of talked about 20-somethings embracing a sort of vegan sexuality of how they were going to date and who they were going to date. So there are some changes in which veganism is a little more normalized than it was 25 years ago, but the normalization of meat eating acts at such a bigger level. It's kind of like the sky. It's like that Star Trek episode where people think they're living on a planet, but one man walks to the top of the mountain and he touches the sky, and he should not have been able to touch the sky. You know, he comes back, he says, I touched the sky. We want people to touch the sky and say, holy cow, why did we believe that doing this to animals for our food was ever right? The more pressure there is on meat eating, the more regressive the ads become. So that the real misogyny of an ad like Manthem, a Burger King ad, in which men all unite against women who are going to have them eat quiche, which generally is not seen as vegan, that they all unite and they're singing a parody of I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar. So they take all these iconic images from second wave feminism, the radical feminism of the late 60s and early 70s, and they parody it. At one level, they're having fun, and at another level, they're serving misogyny with their meat. For many years, I looked for a soundbite for the sexual politics of meat. It's a dense theory in many ways, and the soundbite I realized was that in this culture of misogyny, this culture of speciesism, women are animalized and animals are sexualized and feminized. And it's at that intersection that we've got to look at it and expose it. So women's oppression is intensified by association with female animals. And female animals' oppression is intensified by taking all that misogyny and dripping it over their lives. So what do we offer instead? If I'm saying in Sexual Politics of Meat and Pornography of Meat that inequality was made sexy, and I realized inequality was made tasty, that what happens is that privilege creates an experience of pleasure, and the pleasure is experienced without recognizing that there was privilege that created it. And my simple message is that equality is sexy and equality can be tasty. Veganism is a wonderful way of embracing this sense of egalitarianism. In the Sexual Politics of Meat, I coined a term called feminized protein. And that's the protein, or that's the food that we extract from cows through milk and taking eggs from chickens. I wanted a term that recognized that these foods were coming through a female body. And it was when I was working on this in the 1980s that I became a vegan, that I realized I needed to become a vegan. Feminized protein occurs through the manipulation of the reproductive cycles of female animals. Meat eaters say there wouldn't be any animals if I did not eat them. And I say there would be no animals if we weren't keeping female animals pregnant down on the farm. All animals are coming from female animals. You have nothing to do with it. But this idea that it's meat eaters who motivate creation when they're actually motivating death and suffering. Our culture is very uncomfortable with knowing what happens to animals. Our culture is very uncomfortable being reminded what is required for people to be eating dead animals. In the sexual politics of meat, I took the literary concept of the absent referent and politicized it. And I said that meat results from the structure of the absent referent. Animals disappear as animals to be consumed. And they disappear in three ways. Animals are absent referents in three ways. They disappear literally. We kill them. They disappear conceptually. We rename them. People aren't eating a cow, they're eating a hamburger. They're not eating a lamb's leg, they're eating a leg of lamb. People are participating in the death of animals all the time, but they don't want to think about that. And then animals disappear metaphorically, where their oppression is lifted out of their experience and applied to others. So when a woman says, I felt like a piece of meat, we know what she's saying. I felt like an object who was consumable by another person. But in fact, meat has no feelings. Meat, by definition, is dead. It is the absence of feelings. So a woman saying she felt like a piece of meat is trying to describe how horrifically she felt when she can't feel if she's actually a true piece of meat. It's this intersecting point that's showing the sexual politics of meat. In our culture, when a woman is animalized, she'll be shown on all fours. There will be ways of making her appear animal-like. Pornography does this all the time, animalizing women. I think one of the key aspects of intersectionality is that before you get it, you don't see it anywhere. And once you get it, you see it everywhere. So what's the transition? What's the point that creates this new way of seeing intersections? It could be as simple as looking at a Carl's Jr. ad that says, breasts so big we can't show them on television. And then they've blocked out the breasts of a chicken. So they're using the fragmentation of women and the sexualization of women's breasts to sell dead, fragmented chicken's parts. If you look at it without the insight of intersectionality, you look and think, well, that's kind of disgusting, or isn't that silly? But when you look at it from the perspective of intersectionality, you see that they're using misogyny to sell speciesism. That speciesism, this attitude of animals are here for us, always needs to be bolstered by other forces. Intersectionality means that in a dominant culture, those who are not dominant for reasons of gender identity, sex, race, class, or species find themselves categorized together so that women's oppression is intensified by associating us with non-human animals. The whole Western philosophical tradition had this view that women were less rational than men, women were more animal-like, or the idea that African Americans were beasts. So the intersectionality there was to see African Americans as less than white males by associating them with animal qualities or animal characteristics. Intersectionality is the point at which oppressions come together so that something happening to women is intensified because she's being associated or depicted as animal-like, or something having to do with the issue of workers is made more potent by seeing them as less human rather than dignifying them, has made them more animal-like. So one aspect of intersectionality is that there is a tightly guarded human-animal border or barrier or species barrier. And the non-dominant human is going to be pushed towards that human-animal barrier in association. One aspect of intersectionality is even found in how we define human. The qualities we associate with being human are qualities that we associate in Western philosophy with being the rational middle class or upper middle class white male philosopher. Being rational, being autonomous, using one's mind rather than having an embodied sense of relationship to the world. But it's a false construction. So when feminists intervene against intersectionality, one thing that feminists are saying is we don't accept this definition of human. My role is not to be seen as less animal-like and more like the dominant image of humanity, the white middle-class male. My goal is to dethrone that notion of being human, because out of that notion of being human is created all these complex interactions and almost jostlings. Oh, I'm not like them, I'm more like him. The problem with that notion of the human is that it's not true. All of us actually think with our whole bodies. That's what intuition is, that's what empathy is, that's what being connected is. All of us are not autonomous. In fact, none of us is actually autonomous. We can't learn to walk or talk on our own. Autonomy is a myth that then got linked with our notion of success and our notion even of who is sort of the constitutionally protected person in the United States. The independent person who doesn't actually exist. But we live in a culture in which representations of oppression continually uphold the idea that there is this autonomous human who is male and needs all these things that the representations are then selling to him. You could have a range. You could say, well, Burger King, Carl's Jr., Hardee's, they're appealing to the fraternity boy culture. They're going to have lots of jokes, lots of misogyny against women in their ads for meat eating. They're appealing to that level. But then you could look at even food critics and this whole new way of talking about food by food writers. And they talk in ways that sexualize food. They'll call some foods by very sexualized terms. The whole thing is a kind of boy culture in itself, and the looking for the most extreme examples of meat eating. So you've got a sort of masculinist bias in food culture. After I wrote The Sexual Politics of Meat, within 2 weeks, people started sending me images. It was sort of like, I think, there were people around the world who thought, oh, here's someone who gets it. When I send her this really disgusting menu from Chicago that says double D cup breast of turkey sandwich, she'll get it. And so I started getting all these images, and I had to learn and inquire and ask myself, what are they all saying? I mean, some of them were obvious. They were combining the fragmentation of women with the fragmentation of animals. We would not have meat eating without the fragmentation of animals. Then a couple years ago, I was called by a Memphis reporter, and she had this image for Memphis in May at this huge barbecue fest. And it showed a sexualized pig standing up, all her nipples, in this sort of retro pose. And it was based on an old poster. And feminists in Memphis challenged it and said, this is sexist. And the artist and the Memphis in May people said, this is art. And when I looked at it, I thought, this is hate speech. This is hate speech parading as advertisement, because what it's saying is this body that's inviting me to come to Memphis is already dead. This is a dead pig who's going to be barbecued, so-called whole. But by posing the pig in a way that the pig would never appear, bipedal, on two legs and all, what they were invoking was women's body. So the frisson of the image is just who are they eating? Who's consumable? And if it weren't for the already sexual consumability of women, that image would have had no impact. So that's an example of hate speech using speciesism to intensify an attitude about women. The question of language is key to how we talk about intersectionality. Some people want to say it's just an animal, it's just an ad, as though just somehow makes it all okay. It diminishes the impact. Objectification is viewing another being as an object rather than as a subject. The result of objectification is that people relate to another being, not recognizing that being, but using that being. So objectification occurs when someone is raped or battered. A batterer or a rapist often will not use the person's name. They have to become an object. And of course, we objectify animals all the time. Speciesism is the attitude that looks at other animals with prejudice, which assumes that other animals are not worthy of being seen as subjects because they aren't human. Speciesism is the notion that humans are so different from all other animals that they have the right to do whatever they wish to other animals to please their own palates or to extract labor or food from them. Speciesism was coined by Richard Ryder, I think in the early 1970s, and he deliberately coined it to parallel sexism, racism, classism. In coining speciesism, he wanted us to focus, I believe, on the notion that species is a false category. And once we impose a false category on our thought processes, we become permitted to act monstrously to anyone we don't define as human. Misogyny is hatred of women. We don't see that word used as frequently as it used to be in the 1970s when the feminist movement really began to point out how many statements and how many opinions were misogynistic. But in this second decade of the 21st century, there is so much misogyny dripping all over the place. The whole debate about women's bodies that's happening in American culture in this second decade is a sign of misogyny. What I notice about misogyny is that misogyny then uses speciesism to make it more intensified. When we talk about representations, one of the ones that stands out for me is a picture of a cow in a fire truck. And the question is posed, if she weren't pregnant, what would she be doing? So it's an ad for a drug that's going to help cows continue to get pregnant. Of course, cows don't continue to get pregnant. Cows are impregnated. Right from the beginning, you've got a highly intensified, misogynistic, and speciesist image. It presumes that cows are meant to get pregnant to produce more cows or veal calves. It presumes that we have the right to do this to cows, reduce their lifespan from 20 years to 4 years. But it also has this very subtle reference to women taking men's jobs, because they're showing the cow has become a fireman. which was one of those contested areas. Could women be firemen? So if women weren't pregnant, what would they be doing? They would be taking men's jobs. And then we end up in the reproductive free-for-all that's called right-wing reaction to birth control and abortion. All in one ad. On one level, that ad is just funny. It's making fun. But that's its potency. As long as people think it's just being silly, they don't look at what I'm saying is intersectional oppression that it's expressing. We have a symbolic association of meat and masculinity, or meat and virility. It's so deeply embedded now. It's mythological. And I think that's one reason we have hyper ads about it. It's part of our myth that this is needed. And there's several examples against it. Thoreau laughed at the man who he was talking to who said, "Oh, I couldn't be a vegetarian, I need my strength," and they were walking behind two oxen. And Thoreau wanted to point out to him, the oxen were doing the work, what had the oxen eaten? The idea that strength comes from strong animals. First of all, what's strength? Even back in the early 1900s, Irving Fisher did these experiments at Yale, and he had meat-eating football players, vegetarian football players, vegetarian non-athletes, and meat-eating non-athletes. And he was looking at the kind of strength that is endurance. So he had people do leg lifts and other exercises that required stamina. And those who lasted the longest were the vegetarian athletes. Then next was not the non-vegetarian athletes, but the vegetarian non-athletes. He felt that there was this kind of strength that came from vegetarianism, and did the studies to prove. I was already a feminist when, in the early 70s, a beloved pony of mine was shot and killed. And that night when I went to eat a hamburger, I stopped in mid-bite and realized that I was eating a dead animal. But that knowledge and that self-questioning ability, I think, came from feminist consciousness. Dairy is a feminist issue, definitely. It just hit me one day that there was a connection. And I spent the next 15 years figuring out what it was, and the result was the sexual politics of meat. I've been asked which came first, my feminism or my veganism. My feminism came before my veganism. Along with my two sisters, I was raised a feminist. But also in my life as a child, animals played an immense role. Their nurturing, non-judgmental presence, their spirit of fun. A few years ago, when I finished another book on the subject, I thought to myself, when will I be done writing on this? And I realized, animals have given me so much in my life. I'll never be done. So which came first? While a sophomore at the University of Rochester, I attended my first women's liberation meeting. It was organized by many of the women leading the anti-war movement at the U of R. I started reading everything that was available and was lucky enough to read feminist theory practically at the moment it was being formulated. As a part of my Yale Divinity School studies, I did field work at the New Haven Women's Liberation Center. The following year, the day after I arrived back at my parents' home, my pony was killed in a hunting accident. That night, deeply grieving, I bit into a hamburger and suddenly realized I am eating a dead cow. I knew I had to stop eating dead animals and become a vegetarian. Within a month, I experienced a moment of revelation. My feminism and vegetarianism were related. I was doing feminist studies through Harvard Divinity School. One day, walking toward Harvard Square, I started thinking about all the associations I was coming upon. Feminists in the 19th century who were vegetarians, feminist novels that included a move toward vegetarianism as part of the feminist awakening of the hero, that a patriarchal ethics naturalizes and normalizes violence, I began to see how patriarchal ethics perpetuates human exceptionalism that permits the oppression of other beings. I remember having a feeling of almost levitating as the many dimensions of this connection ran through me, like a current. As I was working on the manuscript that would become The Sexual Politics of Meat, I came upon a 19th century reference to animalized protein. In other words, all protein is plant protein. We can either eat it directly or process it through animals. The question for me became, what should we call dairy and eggs? Recognizing that these foods require the reproductive slavery of female animals, I understood that they needed to be named as well. So I coined the term feminized protein. Once I had named and understood this, my veganism became inevitable. And so my feminist veganism, my vegan feminism, braided together and delivered me into both a book and my life.